Greetings and welcome to The New Normal, Resources and Skills for Adjusting and Living Well with BRCA. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may submit your questions anytime by typing them in the Ask a Question field on the left side of your screen. If anyone should require technical support during the conference, simply click on the question mark icon on the top right corner of your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce Pamela Klein, Bassler Center Outreach Manager. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you, Diego. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. The Bassler Center for BRCA at Penn Medicine's Abramson Cancer Center is the only center in the world solely devoted to BRCA-related cancers. The Bassler Center supports cancer care and BRCA research at every stage, including communication, outreach and risk assessment, prevention, early detection, treatment, clinical trials, and survivorship. Dr. Edward and Merry Prostic have generously established this webinar as part of the Elizabeth Prostic Memorial Outreach Program in memory of their daughter. The following video is a tribute to Elizabeth, her incredible life, and her dream of creating communities that increase awareness about BRCA and metastatic cancers. The Bassler Center is proud to be a part of this mission by providing life-saving information and hope to individuals and families worldwide. Please begin the video.
Merry Prostic was an amazing young woman who believed in the promise of tomorrow. And though her tomorrows were cut short, we can celebrate and sustain her optimism. Lizzie lived large. She loved the stage and brought it to life with her voice and her energy as a talented child and as she grew into a woman. Her world was full of loving friends and family, and success in class, in sports, with girls, and with boys. Sophomore year of college, Lizzie met Michael Lundblad, a liberal and an English major. He got a preview of her leanings when he saw her quizzing a friend about senators. But she learned to love camping. He learned about couture. And political opposites, Michael and Lizzie spent 10 years together, marrying their minds and their passions. Michael loved her boldness and her softness, her interest in so many different types of people, and ability to remember the small details of their lives. The time she made to talk with her grandmother, her pearls, her red shoes that said she was not afraid to be noticed. She was not afraid. Lizzie's intellect and drive were rewarded with exciting opportunities. She blazed through the University of Pennsylvania and into the halls of government, determined to win in every venue and for every cause that was important to her. Her work for senators and on committees quickly made her a Washington insider. She rose to chief privacy officer and senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce before being lured away to the private sector. Not yet a lawyer, she was named managing director at Sonnenschein, Nath, and Rosenthal in Washington, D.C., and was completing her law degree at night at George Washington University when she died. When Lizzie was awarded a posthumous degree at the law school graduation, the entire audience stood in tribute to her spirit. Lizzie was 31 when she was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and her daughter Harper was 4 months old. Michael did research. Lizzie didn't want to know the odds, expecting to beat them. But the cruel reality was that although breast cancer is generally curable, metastatic breast cancer is not. And they found little support to help them deal with the psychological and emotional realities they had to face. In her last months, Lizzie and her family began to envision an online support network that would show patients with metastatic disease that regardless of how long they have to live, they have the ability to control how they live. This was Lizzie's final cause, and one which will be honored. Lizzie wanted to see her daughter's first birthday. She didn't make it, but she lives on in the people who loved her, and through grants such as this one being made in her name. And in truth, none of us knows how long we'll live, so we all should listen to Lizzie and make the most of every tomorrow. Live large, live strong, and wear red shoes.
Today's program will discuss the emotional needs of individuals and families facing hereditary cancer and cancer risk. You may type questions into the Q&A box on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Today's entire program will also be archived and available for viewing. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Allison Werner-Lin. Dr. Werner-Lin is an assistant professor at the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania, where she conducts research addressing psychosocial aspects of genomic testing. She maintains a private practice with families affected by hereditary cancer syndromes and bereavement. Allison, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. I'd like to say that much of my clinical work is with children like Harper who have a mom or a dad die early and then learn to integrate that loss over the course of their lives in many different kinds of ways, and both medical and psychosocial as they grow. I wanted to start with a quote today, and I did a little search, and I found this one by Michael J. Fox, who is living beautifully with a chronic condition, and so I thought this might be a good way to start us today. Acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means understanding that something is what it is, and there's got to be a way through it. And that's what my hope is that we'll be able to take away from our time together. I'm going to spend our time together talking mostly about communicating in families, strategies and skills and focal points for talking with our peers and families, and then within and across generations. And I'm going to end with some strategies for talking with children. People often come to me and ask how to talk to their young children or their adolescent children about BRCA and cancer risk, when it's a good idea or a time to start. And so I do want to address some of those questions and concerns today too. Here's our basic agenda. This idea of the new normal has found its way into our media, our news media around BRCA, and so I want to talk just briefly about that, talking to family members, talking to children, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to find good sources for social support and psychosocial support, formally and informally, within the Penn system, but also in your local areas, as we have today with us people from all over the place. So, what is the new normal? This idea of the new normal captures the ways that life changes rapidly with the diagnosis of a cancer or with the identification of a BRCA mutation. Not necessarily that piece, but what happens next. How does life settle back down, if life settles back down, into a new routine, into a new set of relationships, a new set of cancer risk strategies, a new set of ways of talking with people in your family and beyond about what's happening in your life. And a lot of this gets codified in this idea of anticipatory loss and regrowth. The idea of anticipatory loss, which is critical especially for people who are considering risk-reducing surgeries or other major life changes around their BRCA mutation status, is that we anticipate probable, possible, or even inevitable future uncertainties. Sometimes those uncertainties include expectations about cancer diagnoses and loss, and sometimes those uncertainties include expectations which include hope and survivorship. And we want to include all of those. But the uncertainty piece becomes central to this way that we live with BRCA mutations once they've been identified. That there is no clear, we have a better sense now with research about the whens and the hows and the whys, but there's still a great degree of uncertainty which characterizes a lot of our interactions with family members and with medical people that are involved in our care. the way we respond to this ambiguity can change over time and include a variety of different emotions. And part of the new normal is normalizing or coming to understand and live with the shock, anger, denial, any variety of emotions that come from considering a mutation status or cancer risk. And as we move through the life cycle, we'll find that there are times when it becomes much more poignant and times where it becomes much more on the back burner, and that those times as we come closer to our risk, whether it's presenting for screening or considering surgeries or talking about risk management and cancer risk with loved ones as children grow, that our grief reactions may be very strong and we may even be surprised by them. So part of the new normal is also giving ourselves some time, some space, and some basically some self-love, so that when we hit those times of intense emotion around our cancer risk, we can sit with it and then move through it as the emotion comes to bear. I want to make very clear that there's no one good way to cope with, to talk about, to address the psychological or the social, the family issues that arise when considering a BRCA mutation or any other kind of family condition or illness. That the ways that we address those concerns in our lives vary based on where we're from, who we're close to, what resources we have at our disposal at any given moment. And they're not only vary by person, but they vary within people over time. So what works for you right at the beginning of genetic testing may not be the best strategy for you personally to cope with your risk from an emotional perspective later on. So we want to also attend to, in this new normal, the idea that that uncertainty also captures our emotions and how we deal with those emotions over time. Okay, so talking with loved ones about BRCA. I want to talk a little bit about family communication and disclosure as it relates to BRCA mutation status. And then we're going to talk very concretely about how you find the right words, when and how you tell someone, and I'll give you some good tips on having these conversations. One of the most important pieces from your provider perspective is that family communication about cancer risks helps everyone make informed choices for themselves. They, without an adequate or comprehensive family history, it becomes harder to get a sense of what's going on, both emotionally and medically. So talking about cancer risk helps everyone in the family make informed choices for themselves. It's important to remember, and I'll talk about this a little later on, that not everyone always wants to know about their risk or your risk, and not everyone wants to talk about it in the same kinds of ways, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Some of the emotional conflicts that are already in families can be heightened with discussion of cancer risk, because this can be a very emotionally laden topic. And when we communicate openly within families about risk, about choices, about autonomy, and the capacity for everyone to make a choice that's good for them, the hope is that some of those conflicts can be easily resolved, or resolved not easily. And later on, I'm going to give you recommendations for referrals to other kinds of providers, mental health providers, who can help families have difficult conversations around expectations for cancer risk or risk reduction. It's important to remember, too, that people in your family, or people in general, are more apt to pursue genetic testing if they understand what it's about. And that includes they know that there are interventions available that are effective and that they can live with. And our capacity to find different kinds of risk-reducing methods acceptable varies by person. It varies by where we are in the life cycle. So, for example, a risk-reducing salpingo oophorectomy, risk-reducing removal of the ovaries, is something that may be much more acceptable to someone who's finished using their ovaries by having children, but it may be a whole lot less acceptable to someone much younger. So we have to think about at what point in the life cycle a lot of this makes sense. People are more apt to pursue testing also if they're familiar with their family's medical history, which takes us right back to the importance of communication, and if they're close to someone who was diagnosed with a hereditary cancer. And as I assume most of you in this community, with risks of expression of different breast and ovarian cancers, the chances that you're related to someone with such a medical history is quite high. Next slide. So how do we talk about this? Well, early ideas about disclosing or sharing cancer risk information, measured it as a yes or no. Have you told people or have you not? And when social scientists like myself got involved in the process, we started looking at when and how, not yes and no. So when do people share information, and how do people share information with families and with the wide network of loved ones, family, friends, neighbors, providers, who they care about? And what we found is that people who have cancer risk find it a lot easier to disclose or to talk about their mutation status, starting simply and working up. We start small and work up, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit on the next slide as well. If we think about also starting with simple information and then broadening the circle, and starting with people who are close to us and then broadening that circle. The thinking behind that is that this information is very complex, and most people we talk to may not have an introduction to or an understanding of some of the genetic concepts that have come to be very familiar to those of you who have been engaged in genetic testing and through genetic counseling. By starting with small concepts and working up, we can make sure that the people we're talking to stay with us, both in terms of their cognitive understanding but also emotionally. And starting from small, tighter groups of relatives, your immediate family, your partner, parents, siblings, and then moving out to cousins, aunts, uncles. Beyond that, gives us a chance to try our language and measure the responses of others with those people we feel the most comfortable with before we move into outer circles, and by that time we have a script and we've workshopped it a little bit, and it may feel more comfortable. The language of talking about risk may be much more comfortable. How do we find the right words? Well, let's start with the objective medical information that you get from your doctors and your genetic counselors. Explain your results in the plainest language you possibly can. The challenge with this is removing your emotional experience of testing so that the person you're speaking to can have their own reaction that's independent of yours. And the reason that's important is to make sure that all the family members who know about their risk can make decisions about testing and risk management that are good for them and their needs. What's good for one person in a family is not always the best decision at that moment for everyone. Share your personal risk of developing cancer, starting with yourself and using statements that start with the word I. I have a risk of developing cancer. By the time I am 70, my risk is X. My risk is Y. Helps the person you're speaking to understand what you are facing, and that helps build empathy and emotional connection across relationships. Then educate your family member about what his or her risk of being a mutation carrier is. As a parent, each of your children has a 50% chance of carrying the mutation as well. That's important to know so that your person you're speaking to, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a child, an adult child, or a young child, understands what their stake is. And then educate that family member or that loved one about what you were told about methods of taking care of yourself, methods of risk reduction. Those are some of the very basic strategies. It's definitely okay to share your opinions and your reactions if they're asked for, and they probably will be, because these are people who generally care a lot about you, and they're invested in your health in addition to their own. And in fact, some may be much more worried about what this information means for you, and want to talk about what this information means for you before they're ready to talk about what it means for them. Remember that at the time you have these conversations, you've been thinking about this for quite a while. You've probably gone through some sort of genetic counseling. You've gone through testing. You've had your results back. You've had initial conversations or thoughts about what your plan for self-care and minimizing risk might be. But the person you're speaking to may be learning this information for the first time, and they haven't had that period of time to adjust. So focusing on your own cancer risk for them might be a little bit emotionally easier. So I want to move on to some very specific how-tos. I want you to think, before you start planning these conversations, or at the beginning of this plan, how your family discusses illness and other serious matters. It could be, and this is true for many different kinds of families, that your family doesn't discuss illness, whether it's physical illness or mental illness or other kinds of developmental delays or conditions, that your family is the kind of family that doesn't like to talk about these things together, that they're very much felt privately. It could be that your family talks openly and gregariously about all manner of things. And in each of those situations, it's important to consider what the norms are, what's usual for your family, and how will your family identify that a conversation is important because of the way you've structured it. Does your family generally share information over email or by phone or in person? Do we wait for holiday gatherings and around the table everyone goes around, or whenever there are big pressing issues, everyone gets called together and boom, there you go, right down with the turkey for Thanksgiving, there's a conversation about BRCA, and that happens commonly. It happens also commonly that people choose to send out information over email because individuals who are very emotionally feel very emotionally heavy about their cancer risk or are very concerned about the kind of reactions that family members and loved ones will have, feel much more comfortable being able to plan out in an email what they want to say, how they want to say it, and what information they need to get across. That can help definitely reduce the emotional content of those discussions initially, so the information becomes the primary focus. Does your family generally share information in pairs, one-on-one, or in family meetings and groups? And this is an important thing to remember when we're talking about children over a variety of different ages. I'll talk about this in a little bit, that I want to distinguish between privacy and secrecy. And when children are left out of family conversations, or one sibling, one brother who lives across the country is not a part of conversations, or an aunt, then that can really set the stage for excluding that person from conversations. So it's important that if you decide that a family meeting is a good way to do this, that there are ways, even like this way we're having right now in a webinar, or an online mechanisms for bringing people into the fold. This, of course, becomes much more challenging if there are rifts, which there are in every family, or emotional cutoffs, people you don't speak to, or people who've just drifted away because of distance and time and the activities of daily life. Is it more comfortable for you to deliver information all at once or slowly over time? And this is a matter of your comfort level and what your family generally responds to. Are your family members the types who need a little bit to chew on and then can come back for more? Or are they pretty hardy, they can take a big amount at once? That kind of all-at-once information gives them action points. They don't really need to think on it so much or emote over it, whereas those families who prefer little bits and pieces need to think and chew and feel all the different feelings around this potential risk for themselves before they can move forward and get more information. And then who do you want to tell? Do you want to tell everyone at once, or do you want to pick and choose the people in your family who you think would benefit the most at the present for this information? And I would put in a caveat here that often the choices we make about who to tell, we often choose to be selective in who we tell this information to. And it's important that if you pick out different people in the family, select people in the family to share this information with, remember to identify who is at risk in your family of carrying the mutation as well, and who's at risk also for caring for someone who's carrying the mutation, or having a child with someone who's carrying the mutation, and be sure that they at least have the information to act on, even if the relationship might be more distant because of emotional baggage, or because of distance, emotional or physical. Finding the right words. It's important to remember that one size does not fit all. Different people will want, need, and respond differently to information that you provide for them about your cancer risk. As an example, somebody who is younger, who might not potentially yet be ready to have children, may not be also ready for a much more in-depth discussion about surgical risk reduction. That's fine. Let them know that the door is open, and they can always come back and talk to you or go with you to your genetic counselor or your physician to get more information when they're ready. When given the choice, go simple. It's very easy, and my background is in social work. I'm not a genetic counselor. I'm not a geneticist. I pick up a lot of this as a layperson in the world of science. And I find that when language gets very heavy with genetic concepts and terms, I find that the people I'm talking to are hiding in the intellectual part of the conversation because the emotional part is hard. For these conversations, though, that's okay. Give them the basics. Tell them where they can get more information, and maybe your genetic counselor or your physician has videos or websites such as the Baxter Center or others where you can direct them so that they can go to seek out and accumulate information as they're ready. And here I have that tagline, share your opinion when it's asked. This is a hard one because we want, number one, we want everyone we love to stay safe. and healthy, and we want them to make the best decisions for themselves possible for their care. It becomes a challenge when we disagree with them about what that means. So sharing your opinion if and ask. The other piece of that, which is very important to remember from a family perspective, is that it feels good when people agree with our decisions. So if we make a decision to have risk-reducing surgery, it helps validate our decision and make it feel more valid that we've done this very brave thing if other people around us make the same decision. So it's important to let people think on what makes sense for them and when, but to be open and candid when that's appropriate and when it's asked for. Okay, preparing a script. I find that, and I found this in a lot of different areas of my practice work and in teaching, and even in my own family life, that preparing a script, taking a couple of minutes and writing down a couple of points that I want to get across, or if I know I'm going to stumble over some of the language or some of the concepts or some of the parts that I find more challenging for me to accept, for example, the idea that a child might have risk, that someone you care about and you love, who you're connected to, who's learning about this for the first time, has to help you and watch you cope with this very challenging information, it can be really helpful to write some of those things out in advance. It might feel silly, but I would advise, if you're struggling with any of the language, to practice in front of a mirror and give yourself feedback. And do this because when you talk to loved ones about your cancer risk, they will pick up on your level of comfort with the language. And if we come across as uncomfortable or ambivalent or very distressed, which is very normal by this kind of information, we change the nature of the way our loved ones will respond to that information. We impact that. So if we are distressed as we share this information, which again is totally fine, the loved ones that we're speaking to may take on a caregiving role for you. They want to protect you from any kind of emotional harm that this information could do. And quite truthfully, what the research shows is there isn't harm moving forward, that this gives people agency and the capacity to make good decisions for themselves. Saying the words out loud first gives them an opportunity, gives you the opportunity to develop some comfort with the language. And so I definitely recommend that. And practice the script on a good friend who knows who knows what's going on with you and can give you some feedback. Some things to consider. We've talked about some of these already. How will different family members be affected by learning this news? Some will be caregivers. Some will have risk. Some will not. In a sibling group, some may have the mutation, some may not. Some partners will have to deal with it, some will not. Thinking about those things in advance can help you figure out how to say what you need to say. How much do your loved ones understand about genetics and disease? One of the things that I've found in my research and in my practice is that we often ask very perfunctory questions about how much genetics people understand, like, did you get genetics in high school? And people will say yes, and then we have a basic assumption about shared knowledge, when really those kinds of educational modules in high schools, in other kinds of environments, don't prepare people for the kinds of conversations that need to have around BRCA. This is where visuals can help, and websites and tutorials. A lot of those are available online. And consider individual, family, and illness development. This might be a hard conversation to have with someone who's just had a loved one die. This might be very critical information for someone as they consider entering into a lifelong partnership or having a child. So the timing of this information can be very critical also to how it's received. These are tough conversations. And so I would encourage all of you to seek out support for yourself. Talking with family members can be one wonderful way to seek out and get support, assuming that your family is all on the same page about wanting the information and reacting to it. If there are risks, sometimes those are not the best people to go to. So seeking and providing emotional support beyond your family constellation can be quite critical. Remember that even though the BRCA is inherited and risk may be shared, in conversations with family members, it's important to think about what it means for you, as well as what it means for the others around you who may not react to this information in the same way. I've spoken a little bit about this, about the need for individuals to feel free to make their own decisions Some of you may have made risk management or genetic testing decisions and felt like you didn't really have much of a choice because you had to provide information for people around you who were actively ill, or because this made the most sense to you. Whatever your reasons were that propelled you into genetic counseling, those may not be shared in your family group. It's important that people can come to a course of action that is right for them, and then to support each other in the decisions that you make, even if they aren't the decisions that you would make for your loved ones. Listen. Acknowledge reactions. I understand that you are scared. I understand that you are worried. I understand that you are upset. It's important to use the word I so that you can enter into the conversation with balance. Identify loved ones who need extra support. Sometimes people who have multiple concurrent stressors, so they're moving or they've lost a job or they've started another job or they've just had a new child. When there are other demands on people's energy and time, this kind of information may push them to a place where they need extra support, formal support from a mental health counselor or from their physician. And be prepared. Think about the reasons you learn about your risk for the first time, and definitely come back to your genetic counselor or your physicians with questions. I'm going to read a question about balancing the impact of BRCA in our lives, staying informed versus worrying about new cancer signs. So one of the things that happens often to particularly women where the screening is quite intense is that around periods of screening, anxiety goes up. And then the period between the screening and waiting for your results, whether it's 15 minutes or 15 days, can be the most disconcerting, uncomfortable, distressing time during the year. During those periods, it's really critical to maintain routines, to maintain balance, to seek out ways to cope that are individual for you, that work for you, and also to stay connected to your family and your friendship groups who, although not necessarily focused on BRCA in the same way, can support you in what we call fill up your emotional bank account, because the regular testing can cause some emotional fatigue, and that depletes the emotional bank account. So being able to fill that up in any way that's comfortable to you is important. Starting new routines or health behaviors can also be very common during those periods of stress. So you look at your calendar for the month and realize that your screening is coming up, and so you decide that today's the day you're going to start preparing for a marathon. And you run and run and run and run and run, and then you have your screening and it's fine, and then you can stop running. So these periods of stress and distress turn out to be not great times to start new health behaviors. Think planfully about what would make sense for you outside the context of your screening, so that when your screening comes up, you have something in place that already feels good for you and works for you. I'm going to return to the slides, ways to resolve conflict. It's important to remember that when you're talking to family members, you have a long history of love and shared challenges and distress and hurts. And so even little hurts can feel big because it falls back on a long history of shared living, of living in the same emotional and physical space. Communicate directly as much as you can. We often in families, and I am victim to this too, particularly with my in-laws, and I say that because my mother is actually on the phone right now, on the line listening as a mutation-positive woman herself, that family members will use triangulation, which is like gossip, where you connect with one person over behavior of a third person. I would encourage you away from this because it prevents resolution. When we talk about people behind their back or express our frustrations about behaviors of people that don't support the same kind of risk management strategy that you've engaged in, it can be quite a challenge to get that relationship back online. Try not to keep secrets. There's a difference between privacy and secrecy, and the important thing that distinguishes them is that secrets have the potential to impact others. Secrets that are not shared have meaning and implications for other people around you, whereas private information is information that is just about you. Identify solutions together. How can we figure these questions out together? Would you like to come to my doctor with me? Would you like to come to a therapist with me so that we can talk these things out? And I just had a question about whether or not insurance will cover mental health counseling. The answer is, by and large, yes. Usually, networks have a mental health benefit, and they pay some portion of in-network service. At the end of this webinar, and this can be made available, I have a number of links to different types of mental health counseling so that you can find someone in your area. And then you can look and see if they have expertise in health. And I would recommend grief as well, because there's a trajectory there and a set of clinical skills there that are consistent. It's important, as a final note about resolving conflict, to balance agency or our capacity, the importance of making decisions that are good for us individually, and communion, or the ability to feel like we have a shared challenge that we are fighting together. I'm going to talk just briefly. I know I have got 12:38 p.m. on my computer here, but I do want to talk briefly about working with children and talking with children, because this is some of the most challenging material that parents of young kids find as they absorb all of the information and the implications of BRCA for their children. The first piece, and this is another place where mental health counseling can be really critical, is to get your head around your own risk. And by that I mean feel comfortable with it, understand parts of it, manage the distress in conversation with others, adjust to it and consider our own reactions to it before trying to discuss it with children. Because if we have not yet done that, it'll be harder to respond to our children's needs. And in the moment where we talk with our children, being able to be responsive to their emotional cues is critical to how they will then adapt, understand, and experience emotions around your risk. A word of caution. I put this in bold because it's important, and I've just used my mommy voice on all of you. We recommend that parents avoid withholding information or waiting until a child turns 18 to begin discussion of risk. What happens is when that child reaches 18, they often become angry that parents have in their adolescent brains purposefully withheld information that is critical to understanding how they are becoming adults and what they are going to be addressing and dealing with as adults. There are different ways to have conversations with children younger than that, but children often know something is up in the family, and without any information about what that is, they have no way to cope with it. Your relationship with your young children is best preserved and strengthened if they learn about BRCA from you. Once the adults in your life know about it, it's likely that someone will slip and say something about your status around the child, or that children will overhear what's going on with you. They are very, very tricky. Children, I mean. And so they will learn information, but they need to learn it from you first so that that trust can stay solid, and so that they know when they have questions that you know they're coming to you with those, and that's the most critical. When you start talking to kids, the initial discussion does not need to be a tell-all. They can get this in bits and pieces, and it's important to link it back to other family members. Do you remember when Grandma was sick? She had this mutation that I have too, and now that we know about it, we can do all sorts of things to make sure that I stay healthy as long, so I can take care of you. And those are the kinds of things that children will need to learn. Children across the developmental spectrum may have trouble understanding everything you say. These are very complex concepts. Kids under the age of about 6 are able to identify difference. So you can say, do you know how one of your friends, your friend Johnny has red hair, but your friend Tina has blonde hair? That's because they have a different gene. The part of their genetic code is different, and that leads one of them to be a redhead and one of them to be blonde. Those are the kinds of things that children very young can understand. But as they get older, they'll be able to understand more deeper. So consider tailoring your language for use with different children. And you can do that in the in the same room with children. So don't expect a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old to understand everything you're saying to an older child. They'll pick up bits and pieces and come back to you. I have a question about girls versus boys, and whether and are there differences in the ways that moms and dads should approach these questions. Channeling boys or girls in a family separates them and divides them. So I would very heavily recommend putting boys and girls together. They're both at risk of carrying the mutation, and at that point in their life, the most important thing is that you carry it, not that one of them might or could, or the differences in what that risk will mean for them in the long term. The goal at this point with children is to make sure that everyone feels like they're a part of the family dynamic, that they're involved in it, that secrets aren't being kept, because that can shape the way children value or think about themselves and their self-esteem. I would also advise, if there is a mom and a dad, or two moms or two dads, that they sit down together to have these conversations. That frames BRCA as a family issue, which indeed it is, as all hereditary conditions are. And it gives you, if you are fortunate to have a partner to have these conversations with, some leeway in emotions and how you talk about it, so that if you become choked up or overwhelmed, your partner who has shared this language with you and understands it can take over. So you can ping-pong back and forth a bit as you address the children. Also, different children are close to different parents around different issues. So it may be that around school issues, the disciplinarian is not the same person as when there's an emotional issue. That's the parent the kids are going to. So as much as possible, I would advise being able to come together as a family group to have these conversations. This should be an ongoing conversation throughout the child's life. And as they're ready, they will come back to you. If you can create a situation where kids feel like the door is always open to ask you questions, where they don't have to think about, worry about taking care of you and your emotional challenges with all of this. So if you can present this in a way that's very matter of fact, that you have lots of feelings about it and you're happy to talk about it, but in a way where the child can be the child and have all the feelings and you're the caregiver, then that child is most likely to come back to you when they have questions and when they're ready for more information. It's important to remember, too, that with access almost instantaneously from very young ages to the Internet, as soon as children have information about what to look for online, they will. So you can sit down with kids and look at different websites online so that they can see that there's information out there when they're ready, and encourage them to look for that information with you, not in secret. These are some of the primary concerns about during different stages of childhood. In very early childhood, children don't understand inherited risk. What they do understand is basic human difference, which I mentioned earlier, and concerns about separation and loss. So if a parent is in treatment or required to be inpatient or recovering from surgery, preventive surgery or cancer-related surgery, the impact on those young children is more around the loss and not around future concern for a cancer diagnosis or for their risk in the future. Making sure that they have warm, strong relationships with the people who will be caring for them, making sure that they know who will be caring for them and how, and giving them choices when they can. Do you want to go to Uncle Larry's house, or do you want to go stay with our next-door neighbor for the 2 days while Mom's in the hospital? Those kinds of things help children feel powerful and enhance their self-esteem and teach them great skills about making good choices for themselves. In middle childhood, so middle school, the 10 through, or even 8, depending on the maturity of your child, through early puberty, kids are great information seekers. They know how to open your email without you seeing. They know how to check messages and read mail, but they're lousy interpreters. And what that means is, up until adolescence and even beyond, we tend to blame ourselves for information we don't understand in our environment. So it's important to give kids in those years very concrete information so that they understand there's nothing that they did to cause any distress that they're seeing in the house. There's nothing that they can do or should be doing to fix it because the grown-ups are in charge. In adolescence, with the onset of puberty and the development of secondary sex characteristics, it's important to talk about or open up the door for especially girls to talk about some ambivalence. This is particularly challenging when girls are in puberty when a mother is diagnosed with cancer, because the development of breasts can be associated with that pain and suffering. So it's important to talk about ways to keep the body healthy, about the timing of screening starting, and to have a chance for those girls to talk to, in particular, people around them who can help them feel good about their bodies and in their skin. I have a question. Some people feel a lot of pressure to get everyone tested who needs to in their family. And what do we do with family members who won't behave and go get tested? This is a very critical question and can be incredibly painful and divisive in families. So the only people we can make decisions for are ourselves. We cannot make decisions as much as we'd like to, Mom. Yes, I know you're there listening. Make decisions for anyone else in our families. The best thing we can do is to provide information and resources and keep an open door so that if family members do contemplate what we've talked about, they have the opportunity to come back to you to get information as needed. This can be quite challenging when one family member blocks information for, say, a sibling, a sister who doesn't want information passed on to her daughters. Well, those daughters are likely to know what's going on, and opening a conversation gently without even mentioning BRCA can be critical. Hey, you know, Grandma was sick for a while, or your other aunt was sick for a while with breast cancer. If you two ever have any questions about that, you can always talk to me. And that may help open doors to other people in the family so that a blocker, which what we call them in family therapy, a blocker, doesn't get in the way of someone seeking out information that they would want. This is, again, particularly critical across generations. But within the family, that pressure to get everyone tested is part of our anxiety, our worry, our concern, our distress about our own risk, and wanting to minimize the impact of BRCA over the long haul. It also helps us to feel like we've made good decisions to get this information if other people around us are also getting the same information. And it's hard to sit with if somebody decides to do something differently than you. The best thing to remember in these situations is that BRCA testing and risk management are one in a set of all different kinds of information and decisions that people make in families across their life cycle, including what kind of jobs to get, including where to live, including how to raise their children, including whether or not to practice in a specific kind of cultural or religious tradition. And if we think about BRCA as being one in a series of decisions that families may or may not agree about, it helps kind of minimize the stress of that. I want to go back. We had an early question. Doctors seem reluctant to make clear recommendations about when to move forward with surgeries and in what sequence. Can we make recommendations about how to go about the process of making these decisions? A lot of my research has focused on the early parts of the life cycle. So what happens when women who are transitioning into adulthood or in the early adulthood years consider risk management and family planning alongside each other? And that tends to be one of the more challenging times in life to make these decisions, because women often feel very connected to breasts and the idea of breastfeeding. They want to have biological children, so maintaining ovarian function for a longer period of time, particularly as culturally we're delaying the birth of a first child. So whereas in our grandparents' generation, a first child may have been born when the parents were in their early 20s. Now maybe it's the early 30s or even the early 40s. The idea of making these of when to make these decisions, and I'm actually relieved that doctors are seeming a little bit reluctant to make very clear recommendations, is because it's a very personal choice based on what you're comfortable with, what works for you, and what kind of tolerance you have for the ambiguity around when cancer, what your cancer risk is. There's the best. This is the kind of decision that can be made in concert with a mental health professional to help you clarify what your fears, concerns, values are moving forward, and what kind of quality of life you see for yourself before and after each kind of surgery. So that kind of trajectory is incredibly personal. Some doctors will tell you, I want your ovaries by this time and your breasts by this time, and that's fine. That's based on large-scale research in the populations that may share the same type of mutation that you do. And those are aggregate studies. So keeping that in mind when you make a very personal decision is important. Let's see. We got a question about life insurance. So when you think about testing young adult children, I would advise, and I've heard genetic counselors say the same, to sign up for life insurance first. We don't really know. The genetic testing has created a whole new set of challenges in terms of pre-existing conditions, which the Affordable Care Act has somewhat addressed, but life insurance remains outside the purview of that at the moment. So I would definitely advise, in the moment that before having adult children tested, signing up for life insurance policies definitely in advance. Unfortunately, that's a place where, we know that everyone walking around the street is carrying some kind of mutated gene somewhere in their genetic code that could impact their future health. This happens to be one we've identified first. And so those of you on this call are going to be impacted. You're going to carry greater burden for figuring out how life insurance policies and long-term care policies are managing the transition to understanding this kind of information about ourselves in advance. I want to say that you don't have to do this alone. And these are some of the resources. And I'll leave this slide up. I hope you can see this. On my screen, the green links are quite light. But finding a genetic counselor, if you have not had genetic counseling as part of your BRCA testing, which is more common now with direct-to-consumer testing or with any kind of, if you're living in a rural area or you're not in an area where there are a lot of genetic providers, you may, have gone through a clinic that didn't have a genetic counselor. Even if you have your information, your risk information already, I cannot strongly enough recommend that you find a genetic counselor to talk to about it and about making a plan for a number of reasons. One, the information is changing regularly, so it's important to stay connected. But two, there's a lot of evidence that suggests people who do utilize, go to, and form relationships with genetic counselors adapt better in the long run to those who don't. Referrals to a mental health counselor. I have colleagues across, I'm trained in social work. I have colleagues who are trained in psychology, and I have colleagues who are trained in marriage and family therapy who have expertise in family dynamics, in illness and caregiving, in grief and loss. And there's a growing cadre of mental health providers who work in the genetic space. They may be harder to find, and your hospital center or care center may be able to connect you with those resources, or local advocacy organizations like Be Bright Pink and Force and others like that may be able to connect you to providers, mental health providers, so that you can get help making these decisions about how to move forward and when and in what order with surgery, or how to balance the impact of BRCA in your personal life as you come up against untested family members, as you consider the distress of going in for screening, thinking, is this going to be the time where they find something? So you can figure out how to talk to family members, with family members who don't want to be tested, without anxieties and concerns about how that relationship is going to move forward. So we are at the end of our hour. I wanted to thank you all for being here. If there are any last-minute questions, please do send them in. You can always be in touch with the Vassar Center for any kind of counseling-related needs. It was a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope you've all been able to take away at least a little piece here that will help you adjust even more beautifully to life with a BRCA mutation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Werner-Lin, for this great information today. We are just about out of time for today's presentation. The presentation will be archived and available for viewing this week, along with past Vassar Center webinars at vassar.org/webinar. The date and time for our next webinar, which will be about BRCA mutations in men, will be posted later this month. Thank you again to Dr. Edward and Merry Prostic for making this event possible. Enjoy the rest of your day.